I'll bet we've all had a supervisor or a boss at some time who was a terrible communicator. It was so frustrating. Well, in this session, we're going to give parents some ideas of how they can develop communication skills in their young leaders. I'm going to interview Dr. Denny Coates. He is a longtime military expert and also business expert, but he wrote a book on helping parents develop communication skills with their children as they communicate with them. I think you're going to like this session.
Welcome to another edition of KidLead Academy Training Series with Dr. Alan E. Nelson, designed to help parents develop their children to lead so they can succeed. And now, here's Alan.
All right, our guest today is Dr. Denny Coates. He is the CEO of Grow Strong Leaders, publisher of leader development resources for over 3 decades. He's a graduate of West Point, a retired lieutenant colonel after 20 years of service. He earned his PhD from Duke University, which I love because our son works there. And he has served on the faculties of the U.S. Military Academy, the Armed Force Staff College, College of William and Mary, and a wonderful institution, the Center for Creative Leadership. His recent book, Connect with Your Kid, is a guide for parents to improve high-impact parent-child communication skills. Denny, thanks for being with us on KidLead.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Hey, I'm excited to delve into this. I talked to you while I was teaching at the Naval Academy, and I finished up for the day, and we just had a wonderful time. I remember staring out at the Chesapeake Bay and talking to you, being mesmerized by all the things you've done. And of course, I was thinking military, and you have a military background, so I can appreciate how you have taken those skills professionally, and now you're trying to help parents learn and apply those in their family life. So again, I love that. Tell us briefly about your family so we can have a little bit of context from you as a parent.
Well, I have 2 boys, and they're still active in the workplace. Both of them are in IT. The oldest boy has a PhD in business, and he's had lots of experience leading IT groups. And the youngest boy is a supervisor of software engineers in a startup. And they've been in this business all their lives. I got lucky when I was a parent because this was 40 years ago. And they showed an interest in computers, which was interesting because that wasn't a common thing in the home at the time. But I thought, I don't know what I'm going to get them for Christmas. I think I'll get them each a Commodore 64, which was one of the very first home desktop computers.
I remember those.
Did that, and what they did was trade video games and things like that with their friends until they had literally seen them all. And they thought, well, how can we create our own programs? And so I didn't even have to buy the book, but they just got a hold of a programming language book and learned how to program on their own. They're pretty much, to this day, self-taught men.
That's a great story to begin with, not just telling a little bit about your role as a parent, but how often we underestimate the capacity and the abilities of kids, right? And I guess even that name, I was interviewing Robert Epstein, and he said, I don't even like the word kid because it refers to a baby goat, right? So, that's the vernacular in our culture. But the bottom line is they can do so much. And I want to put a little context in why I'm so honored to have you here on this program. Is because this program, if you're just watching or listening for the first time, this program is not about parenting. This program is about how to develop your child's leadership potential. And yet, we all, as leaders, those of us who are leaders, know communication is quintessential. It is so important. And if we ever hope to develop our child's leadership potential, obviously, not only do we teach leadership in communication and communication and leadership, but also we need to effectively communicate with our children. So, whether they're young, whether they're teens, whether they're young adults, we really do need to do that. So, that's why I'm pretty excited about hearing what you've learned and why this is a passion. So, let's just start with that question. How do you decide to focus on parents helping develop their leadership or their communication skills with their young leaders or with their children?
Well, I didn't start out that way. When I retired at about the age of 42, I realized that, I had actually studied leadership. I mean, that's what the cadets do at West Point, and they get a lot of leadership experience. And of course, in my career, that's all I did. And so I thought, I need to help people in the workplace with this. I can share some of what I've learned. And so I started a company, and today it's called Grow Strong Leaders, focusing on leadership at all levels. And one of the things that I discovered after a few years was when people come into the workplace, they don't usually have the communication skills that they really need. And the communication skills are crucial. I mean, you can talk about leadership, and maybe you can read books about leadership, and you can watch videos about leadership, and you can listen to Tony Robbins standing on that stage, and so on and so on. But in order to lead, you have to connect. You have to communicate something. If you never did, you wouldn't be leading. So I decided to focus on that. And I realized that wouldn't it be great if young people came into the workplace better prepared? That means something has to happen in the family. So the truth is that, and from my point of view, is that what makes a good leader also makes a good parent,
Good. I like that.
because you're exercising your influence with people, trying to guide them in do this and do that for a good purpose. So that's where my interest in parents began. I thought, let's teach some of this stuff to parents. And so I've done that. I've written several books about it. The very first book for parents that I wrote was called Conversations with the Wise Uncle. And then another book, Conversations with the Wise Aunt, talking to young women. And but it was interesting because all my career and ongoing and to this day, I've been interested in how the brain works. And the reason is because that's where you learn. When you learn something, there's something going on in the brain. There are changes, whether it's a concept or a skill. They call it muscle memory, but it's not in the muscles at all. It's up here. So I really felt I needed to understand that. So I just have had this interest. And I realized something in my reading, my study of the brain, is that at puberty, young people experience an activation of growth hormone. And it affects their bodies. It also affects their brains. Now, if you're a parent, you've seen this. You've seen how the different parts of the human body that are involved in reproduction. I mean, that all happens, and but there's something going on in the brain too. I didn't know this until I found out. What's happening is that all of the brain cells in the prefrontal cortex is where executive thinking happens. It's right up in here. All the brain cells are growing new connector fibers, synapses, hundreds of them on each brain cell, all new. And the reason this happens is because it's part of preparing a young person for the next phase of life. And that is fantastic, because as you learn the things that will prepare you for adult life, your brain builds with these connections and circuits form. And that's, when you become an adult, that's there. And so that's your foundation for success. Well, it's kind of obvious that not everybody builds the same number of circuits in the prefrontal cortex by the time they're an adult. You've got people like these folks running for president, for example, or lawyers or doctors and engineers and so on. They've done the work. In order to make those connections, you have to use the skill. The more you use the skill, the more that circuit forms. And so one way of looking at adolescence is it's a time of brain growth. So I thought, man, parents need to know about this. So I wrote this book called How Your Teen Can Grow a Smarter Brain, so that they understand that this period of growth. And let me tell you something, Alan. You may already know this, but this period of growth comes to an end at the end of adolescence. All of those unused connector fibers dissolve. And so the foundation that you worked on when you were a teenager and it's formed, that's it. Now you can build on that foundation, but man, there's a big difference between a massive foundation and a tiny one. And you've seen adults who are on both ends of the spectrum. You see them every day. And that's the reason for this. They just have this power or they don't. And
I think that's one of, and you said it so well, but the science talks about this neuroplasticity and how we always have it as humans, but it definitely decreases by 25. And there is that, and you're referring to that, that same thing of this ability to learn early skills. And that's that burden I feel every day, trying to help adults to focus on future leaders who are currently the kids and the teenagers and the adolescents today. So, waiting until they're in their 40s to teach them formal leadership training is way too late. What are some, Denny, what are some things that you recommend parents do to improve the way they connect with their kids?
well, it's about connecting. It's about communicating. And so you want to focus on communicating skills as a parent. Now, you and I are in this business of teaching these kind of communication skills. And I'm sure you're aware that there are dozens of them. I mean, a parent could get overwhelmed. So one of the pieces of advice I give is to focus. And you want to focus in two ways. One is focus on the high impact skills, the ones that you use a lot, that really count the most. And the other thing is that while you're trying to improve those skills, focus on one at a time. I wrote this book called Connect with Your Kid, and it focuses on the 10 what I feel are the high impact communication skills for parents. But if you love that book and you say, wow, I want to be better at all that stuff. Well, if you take on all of it, it really dilutes your effort. And building skills can be discouraging. I mean, you read about it, you hear about it, or whatever. You might even be introduced to some of it in a course. But in order to build a skill, you have to practice it. Everybody knows that.
Yeah.
You have to get the reps. And So that means making a commitment to do that in your parenting, in your life with your child. So you focus on one skill. I usually advise listening as the first skill. And the reason is because it's so powerful. Kid loves to be understood. If a kid feels that they're not understood, that's a bad thing, because they'll move away from you and you won't be connecting. And there's so much they need to learn. They need skills themselves, for example.
So let me interrupt you a minute, because I think that's kind of a dichotomy, a very interesting thing. Is it seems like as parents we get into this mode because, as you said, they have so much need to learn, of always talking, and yet the first skill you picked out was listening. So help us unpack that a bit. How does listening to our child help us instill them with all this wisdom we feel the burden to do, so that we're always talking?
Yeah. Well, there are two skills that I love the most. And if you work them together, it's like dynamite. And the skills are the skill of asking open-ended questions. Not the kind of question, for example, if a child comes home from soccer, you could say, did you like soccer today? And the answer is, or yeah. Well, that doesn't get them to think. You want to say, what did you like about soccer today? Or what do you like about your coach? And that gets them to think. And as you get a child to think, that's how they start to develop. So you follow that up with listening. So you ask the open-ended question and you follow that up with listening. And it's the kind of listening where you try to understand where they're coming from, where you try to understand what they're saying, what they mean. And if you do that well, they will feel heard. And there's a consequence to that that's absolutely crucial. And that's building a bond between you and your child. If that doesn't happen, then all the other things that you could offer them by way of growth, the opportunities won't be there. They won't be receptive to it because the bond isn't there. So this is a very powerful combo, asking these open-ended questions, which respects their own minds. It says, hey, you've got something to say. You know the answers. Talk to me. That's kind of the implication of this.
Which, as you know, Denny, is how Socrates was, but that's what he was famous for, not telling people what they needed to know, but asking these thought-provoking questions, which taught him how to think, which is the same thing that executive coaches do to high-end CEOs. So, the advice that you're giving us and giving the parents and listeners, it really is high-end, powerful stuff. And I would encourage us not to just dismiss it at saying, oh, it's just about listening. It's about teeing it up by asking these strategic questions. And I love that. So often as parents, we ask those yes, no questions, don't we? As opposed to open ends. So that was great. So how do I know as a parent? I mean, you're talking about skills and we have to practice them, but how do I know if I'm being successful? What are the keys to success in this?
Well, you're going to get discouraged because it's not easy. In other words, you may know what to do, but did you actually do it? And oftentimes you forget, or maybe there's an opportunity to listen and you did not, or you didn't listen very well, or maybe you lapsed into advice and giving instructions and commands and things like that, as if you know everything. And that doesn't build the bond. And so it can be frustrating. You feel a little bit like a failure sometimes if you're really trying hard and you're not really doing what you know you should be doing. Well, you got to stick with it. But if you're discouraged, the question is, will you stick with it? So I also recommend that you partner with someone who also wants to learn these skills. It could be your spouse.
I thought this was, sorry to interrupt. I thought that was a novel idea of parents coaching parents. So
Mm.
yeah, talk to us more about that. I think it's a very novel thing.
Yeah. Well, the actual process of coaching is actually very simple. You're just having a, a chat with another parent. And maybe you set this up that you're going to have these regular discussions about how you're doing with learning communication skills. Um, I think they usually start by, well, how did it go? I mean, that's easy. How did it go? And so that starts the conversation. Well, he came home from practice and he didn't seem like he was in a good mood. And I said, what's wrong? And he just, it all came out. And I was pleased because it worked so well. And that's what that's what happened day before yesterday. So you see, it starts this discussion about what you were trying to do and how well it went. And so you just ask questions about that. Why do you think that it went that way? And is there anything you learned from that? And you can encourage them, and you can say, I've seen you as a parent, and you're actually really good parent, and I know that this is going to work out for you. So that's encouraging. So you do that. Say, let's set up another meeting a couple of weeks from now, and that's it. That's coaching. That's parents coaching parents, and it doesn't require that you get certified or anything like that.
So let me back up and clarify this again. So you're not saying, as sometimes we think, that it's giving each other advice. It's really causing us to think about things that we've seen or in our own minds and learn from our own experiences.
Yeah.
How would, because it seems like, we've probably been that parent, and we've had those parents who kind of want to give us, oh, here's what you need to do. I'll never forget this one this one guy, who they had an only child, and that child really was very compliant, and they were just irritated by everyone else's hellion child, right, who wasn't behaving and was undisciplined. Well, God is good, and he gave them a second child who was that hellion, and it was, all the other parents were just kind of tongue in cheek smiling, because the advice giver had become very humble. So
Ah,
how do we avoid that sort of lecturing, advice giving, when we're developing the sort of peer to peer coaching relationship? Ideas?
yeah, don't do that. You know, you become self-aware, uh, and if you're giving advice and coming on strong like that, it isn't going to work out. It isn't going to be a great conversation. That's not helpful. And so you learn that don't do that. Listen, ask open-ended questions and listen. And so parents take turns coaching each other in this common sense way of talking to each other, and they do that regularly. And hopefully it encourages them to stick with it, because it takes more than weeks to establish a communication skill. I'm sure you're a great listener. Excuse me. Um, but that didn't come overnight. You had to
Not for
work.
me, no.
No, not for any of us. I've made all kinds of mistakes and caught myself doing all sorts of things that are not listening, not good listening. But I'm a real good listener now after all these years. And I've gotten pretty good at asking open-ended questions. And there are other skills, such as encouraging a child, affirming their what their talents and their achievements, whatever they are at their level, giving constructive criticism, and how to do that without making them feel bad. So making them feel good. Resolving conflicts. These are all communication skills. And so it takes a while. It could take years. It's, in my view, it's really a lifelong learning process. You get better and better at it. And, after they leave home and become adults and parents themselves, you can still practice the skills with them.
That's true. That's true. My family, our three sons are now grown. We have two granddaughters, and just 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had rented a Verbo home in San Diego, and it was the first time in 5 years we'd all been together, really since COVID, and it was just so wonderful. But it was funny because my wife and I were kind of thinking and talking to each other about what you just said, that your skills change when your kids become adults and when you have grandchildren, and yet the basics are still there. It's listening and not always giving your advice, and it's just a wonderful time together. What would be some other recommendations that parents can do to raise happy, successful adults?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting. And so here we are talking about how a parent can connect with their own children better, and learning these skills. We call them communication skills. Well, if they're so good, eventually our own children are going to be adults and they'll need the skills also. So why not teach them these skills as you're learning the skills? Teach them how to ask open-ended questions. Teach them how to listen and be patient about it, and encourage them. It's we don't think about that, but that's one of the conclusions that I've drawn, is that part of effective parenting would be to find these opportunities. Maybe the child got angry and lashed out at the parent. So how do you handle that? And so the way I would handle it is to own up to their feedback, apologize, commit to doing it differently going forward, and then telling them, there's a kinder, gentler way of telling me that I screwed up. You may have noticed that I use that way of giving feedback, and you could give it too. If you don't like what I'm doing, here's what you could do. And so they can learn from this. When I left home, I went to West Point, and immediately I was there with my classmates. I had something like 700 classmates, and within the first 2 months, 150 of them left.
Wow.
Yeah, you couldn't take it. And that first year it was very stressful and so on. And in retrospect, I think that's pretty good that people at that age, who are supposed to be future leaders, supposed to lead soldiers in combat and so on, that they experience stress and function anyway. But I discovered that a lot of my classmates were smarter than I was, which was initially a shock, because I was valedictorian of my high school class.
Wow.
I thought I was pretty smart, but I was amazed at the wisdom and intelligence of many of my classmates, and so I ended up learning a lot from them. Now, with parents, in addition to maybe sharing some of the learning with their children, think about the other things that they need for growing up, such as practical life skills, for example, and values, and skills and knowledge and wisdom. Well, you need that bond in order to share all of that. So they're open to it. And so one of the things that they need is to grow strong character while they're young. And one of the ways that they'll do that is by following your example. You know,
Great.
do you tell the truth? Are you patient? You know, and there's dozens of these behavior patterns that make up strong character. And actually, and this has been the past year or so, has been this developing character has been a big deal for me. And I've ultimately finished a book about it called Grow Strong Character. And in the chapters focus on these 36 behavior patterns. And since they're behavior patterns, you can improve them through practice. It's
That's
not
great.
you know, these the more you tell the truth in a tough situation, the easier it gets.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's interesting. A lot of times we think of character as something that's internal and either you have it or you don't. But I like it when you make it behavioral because then you can focus on actually programming your brain and programming your character traits so that you actually exemplify that. And like any skill, you practice it over and over again. It's great.
Exactly. So you learn what some of these behavior patterns are so you can focus on
Hmm.
and recognize in your own life as a parent or a manager or whatever that I should have done it differently. You learn from those experiences.
Yeah. One of the things I liked that you said kind of early on is that even though the purpose of this podcast video is really to help parents develop their child's leadership potential, and you've been a leader, you have a PhD in leadership, 20 years in armed forces, the Army leadership. But I like it how you're saying, there's a lot of similarity between leading a team or leading a company and leading a family,
Yeah,
and that even as we're trying to instill these qualities in our kids, we're learning them, and that I guess we could inversely say that if you're a good corporate leader, a lot of those are parenting skills, and if you're leading a team, a lot of those are parenting skills. So I love the way you put those two together. How can we learn more about your work? Where do we go? What do we read? Tell us about how we can find more about what you do.
well, of course you can always go to Amazon. A lot of my books are there, um, including Grow Strong Character, my most recent one. Connect with Your Kid is one of the books, and also there's a book called Parents Coaching Parents. It's a very slim book, but it gives those simple guidelines about having these conversations. Um, so the books, that's a good way of finding out what I'm all about. Also, I have this website called drdennycoates.com. So it's Dr. Denny Coates, COATES.com. And I've got about 300 articles on that website.
Wow.
So that you can search and find stuff that interests you.
And if you're listening to the podcast, we'll have that information below. If you're watching this on video, we're going to put that in the description, as well as you'll see some of the titles scrolling across the bottom. So, Denny, we definitely need to have you come back and talk about this character thing because it is such a big deal in leadership, especially these days, right? This is an
Yeah.
election year, and everyone's slinging mud, and we have to figure out how we can do better at
Yeah.
developing ethical leaders, right?
Yeah.
So I definitely need to talk to you more about that. Thank you for your time, for your commitment. Thank you for your wisdom. I hope that our listeners and viewers really can appreciate that someone who has invested so much time in leadership development and being a leader and being a father, a parent, that these ideas that you're sharing are really great wisdom and they're gold. So I appreciate you sharing them with us. I've learned from you today, and thank you for our time together, Denny.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you for having me on.